Help my mother! The cowboy untied the Apache woman. The sun had been climbing steadily over the desert horizon, burning its way into the sky with a bright golden glare. It shimmered with heat, and the dry wind whispered across the sands, carrying the scent of sagebrush and dust. On a narrow trail winding through the rocky hills, a lone cowboy rode his horse, the sound of hooves crunching against the dry ground echoing in the quiet emptiness. His hat was pulled low, shading tired eyes that had seen too many miles and too many hardships. The cowboy was used to the desert. He had spent years traveling these lands, guiding cattle, hunting, and helping people in need when he could. But nothing could have prepared him for the sound that suddenly pierced the stillness. It was a voice, high-pitched and urgent, carrying a note of pure fear. "Help! My mother!" The cry came from somewhere in the canyon ahead, bouncing off the jagged rocks and echoing through the silence. The cowboy's hand went instinctively to his reins, slowing his horse to a cautious trot. He scanned the edges of the trail, squinting against the sun. The desert was wide and harsh, but the voice was unmistakable. It came from somewhere close, but hidden among the rocks. His gut tightened with a mix of caution and curiosity. Something was wrong, and he knew it. The cowboy guided his horse down a narrow path that led into a shallow canyon. The rocks rose on either side like walls, casting deep shadows in the afternoon sun. The voice came again, this time trembling. "Please, help my mother." There was no mistake. It was the sound of desperation. He could see movement between two boulders ahead. Slowly, he nudged his horse forward, careful not to make a noise that would alert anyone else who might be hiding nearby. His eyes caught a glimpse of fabric bright against the dusty brown of the rocks. The cowboy's heart quickened. He could see her now, a young woman probably no older than 20, tied to a small tree. Her hands were bound behind her back, and her face was streaked with tears and dirt. Beside her, an older woman slumped against the rocks, her face pale, her breathing shallow, and her eyes wide with fear. The cowboy dismounted quickly, letting the reins fall loosely over the horse's neck. His boots scuffed against the hard ground as he approached cautiously. The young woman's eyes widened as she saw him, a mixture of hope and panic in her gaze. Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "I'm here to help," he said firmly, keeping his tone calm. "I won't hurt you." He kept his eyes moving, scanning the rocks around them, alert for any sign of danger. He could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy like the heat. Whoever had left them here was not far, he knew that. But he also knew that hesitation could cost them their chance to escape. The young woman's lips trembled as she spoke again. They said if I tried to run, they would hurt my mother." Her voice broke, and tears streamed freely down her face. The cowboy's chest tightened at her words. The desperation in her voice struck him deeply. He had seen fear before, but this was different. This was raw, desperate, and real. Without a second thought, he knelt beside her, examining the knots that bound her wrists. They were tight, crude, and meant to hold someone securely, but he had untied many knots in his life, from roped cattle to stubborn old harnesses. This was different. These knots held a human life, praise. Carefully, with practiced hands, he began working at the ropes, loosening them slowly, giving her a chance to stay calm. "Peace, hell," he whispered, not taking his eyes off the surrounding canyon. "You're safe with me. Just hold still." The young woman nodded, shivering, her body tense and coiled with fear. He worked quickly but gently, loosening the rope around her wrists. As the knots gave way, she rubbed her sore skin, relief flooding her features. But the words caught in her throat, a mix of gratitude and fear that she might be overheard. The cowboy glanced at her mother. The older woman was pale, her eyes half closed, and he realized she had been injured or weakened during whatever had happened. He moved to help her as well, offering a hand. At first, the older woman flinched, unsure if he was friend or foe. But then, seeing the kindness in his eyes, she allowed him to guide her to her feet. Together, the three of them stood in the shadow of the canyon walls. The young woman held her mother's arm, helping her steady her balance. The cowboy's horse pawed at the ground, snorting softly. He knew they couldn't linger. Whoever had done this would notice the disappearance soon enough. They had to move. Fast, but carefully. He gave them a quick, reassuring look. "We have to leave now. Stay close to me, and don't make a sound." As they started down the narrow canyon path, the young woman kept glancing back, fear etched into her every movement. Her mother leaned heavily on her arm, groaning quietly at the effort. The cowboy fell into step ahead of them, his senses alert. A desert was harsh, every rock and crevice a potential hiding place for danger. His mind raced with possibilities: bandits, hostile settlers, wild animals. Whatever had led to this moment, he had to get them to safety before anyone or anything found them again. The canyon narrowed further, forcing them into a single file. The young woman whispered softly to her mother, trying to reassure her, though her own voice trembled.
"It's okay, Mama."
"He's helping us. We're going to be safe." Her mother's lips moved, trying to respond, but all that came out was a faint, shaky sound. The cowboy didn't speak. His presence was enough to steady them. His experience told him that words could sometimes cause more alarm than silence. Hours seemed to pass as they navigated the rocky trail. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down on them, making every step a struggle. But they pressed on, the cowboy always in front, scanning for any sign of danger. The young woman's eyes kept darting around, wary of shadows and hidden corners. Every sound made her flinch, the rustle of a lizard, the whisper of the wind against the rocks. Yet, in the midst of fear, there was also a growing trust. She could feel the cowboy's determination, his calmness, and his unwillingness to let anything happen to them. At one point, the trail opened up to a small clearing. The cowboy paused, letting the women catch their breath. The young woman sank to her knees, relief washing over her. "Thank you. Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Her mother leaned against a rock, exhausted but alive. The cowboy gave a small nod, not used to receiving thanks, but appreciating it all the same. "We're not safe yet." "We keep moving," he said. The canyon stretched out before them, a maze of rocks and cliffs, but he knew a path that could lead them to a nearby settlement. It was dangerous and long, but it was the only way. As they moved forward, the young woman held her mother close, leaning on her for strength, while the cowboy led the way with a quiet determination that seemed to calm them both. By late afternoon, the canyon began to widen, the rocks giving way to open desert once more. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the sand. The cowboy glanced back at the two women, noting the tiredness in their steps, the sweat on their faces, but also the spark of hope. He had seen fear many times, but he had never seen a desperation quite like this. Pushed him forward, urging him to be faster, smarter, braver. As the canyon finally opened onto a small, dry creek bed, the cowboy spotted signs of life, distant smoke rising from the settlement ahead, a promise of water, food, and safety. He allowed himself a small sense of relief, but didn't slow down. Danger was still possible. Whoever had left these women bound could be tracking them. "But for now," the young woman whispered again, clutching her mother's hand, I think we're going to be okay." The cowboy nodded silently, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He knew their journey was far from over. But the first step, the hardest step, had been taken. He had answered a cry for help. He had untied a bound woman and her mother. And that, he realized, made all the difference. The sun was sinking lower in the sky, painting the desert in shades of gold and orange. The shadows stretched long across the rocks and sand, making every crevice seem darker and more mysterious. The cowboy led the young woman and her mother through the open desert, keeping his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. Every step forward was careful and deliberate. He knew that whoever had left them bound might still be nearby, watching or even following. The air was thick with the scent of dust, sage, and the faint metallic tang of worry. The young woman kept close to her mother, glancing nervously at every rock and bush. Her heart still raced from the fear of being caught. "Do you think they'll come after us?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The cowboy shook his head, keeping his tone steady but calm. "We don't know," he said. "So we move fast, stay quiet, and don't look back. That's all we can do." They walked for what felt like hours, the heat still lingering even as the sun began to set. The mother leaned heavily on her daughter, and every so often the cowboy would stop and offer a hand or a supportive shoulder. "We're almost there," he said quietly, more to encourage them than to state fact. He knew the desert could be cruel, but he also knew there was a small settlement nearby where they could find safety, water, and help. As the trio moved through a narrow pass, the desert suddenly changed. The rocks rose higher, forming jagged walls on either side, and the wind grew sharper, whipping dust into their faces. The young woman gasped, brushing sand from her eyes. "It's getting harder to breathe," she said, her voice hoarse. The cowboy nodded. He had been through similar terrain many times. The canyon funneled the wind, making it feel colder and harsher than it really was. He pulled a piece of cloth from his pack and handed it to her. "Tie this around your face," he said. "It'll help with the dust." She did as he suggested, and the cloth muffled her gasps and shouts just enough to keep them quiet. The desert was deceptive. Just when it seemed safe, danger could appear. That's why the cowboy stayed alert. He'd noticed small tracks in the sand. Footprints that didn't belong to them. Bandits. "Travels?" He couldn't be sure. But he knew he couldn't ignore them. He signaled for the women to stay close and move silently. Every creak of leather, every shift of sand underfoot felt louder than it should have. The young woman's hands shook, gripping her mother's arm tightly. The cowboy gave a reassuring nod. "Stay calm." We move together, and we watch each other's backs. Night fell quickly over the desert, and the world turned cool and quiet. The stars came out, shining brightly in the dark sky, but the darkness made every shadow seem threatening. The trio huddled in a small alcove, hidden from view by rocks and cacti. The mother sat down heavily, exhausted from the long trek, and her daughter knelt beside her, whispering soothing words. The cowboy kept watch, scanning the horizon, listening for any unusual sounds. The wind whispered through the canyon, carrying distant noises that made him tense. Every crack of rock or rustle of sand could be a sign that someone was coming. The young woman finally spoke, her voice barely audible. Why did they tie us up?" The cowboy shook his head slowly. "I don't know for sure," he said. "But whatever it was, we're not safe here. We have to keep moving." "Danger doesn't wait." She shivered, hugging her mother closer. I just want to get home." The cowboy understood completely. He had seen people in desperate situations before, and he knew that the thought of safety, family, and home was the strongest motivator there was. As they continued their journey under the moonlight, The terrain grew rougher. Sharp rocks tore at their shoes, and the sand shifted under their feet, making it hard to keep a steady pace. The mother stumbled, and the young woman caught her just in time. "Thank you," she whispered, tears in her eyes. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He had to keep them moving, but he also had to make sure they didn't hurt themselves.
"Careful," he said. "We take it slow here."
"Don't rush." Every step was a test, not just of their endurance, but of their courage. Suddenly, a distant sound broke the stillness of the desert night. The faint clip-clop of hooves carried on the wind. Dust. The cowboy froze, crouching low, signaling the women to do the same. "Someone's coming," he whispered. The young woman's eyes widened in terror. "Oh no! They found us!" she breathed. The cowboy shook his head, trying to stay calm. "Maybe," he said softly. "Maybe not. Stay quiet and don't move until I say so." They pressed themselves against the rocks, blending into the shadows. The hoofbeats grew louder, and the cowboy could see a faint silhouette of a horse moving along the distant trail. He counted silently, noting the rhythm, trying to judge the distance. Whoever it was, they hadn't noticed them yet. He held his breath, waiting for the right moment to move. After what felt like an eternity, the silhouette passed by the canyon entrance without stopping. The cowboy exhaled slowly, relief washing over him. "Let's go," he whispered. "We can't stay here any longer." The desert stretched endlessly before them as they continued moving, their shadows long under the moonlight. They had been traveling for hours, but the cowboy knew they were still far from safety. He led them carefully, using his knowledge of the land to find hidden paths and avoid the main trails where someone might be searching. The young woman's voice was quiet, but she spoke to her mother, telling her stories, sharing memories of home, anything to keep their spirits up. The cowboy listened silently, admiring their strength even in the face of fear. Around midnight, they reached a small, dry creek bed. The desert was quieter here, the wind calmer. The cowboy motioned for the women to rest briefly. "Drink some water if you have any left," he said. They had brought only a little, enough for the journey so far, and he knew they couldn't linger. The mother drank slowly, careful not to upset her stomach after the long march. Her daughter helped her, whispering words of comfort. The cowboy kept watch, his eye scanning the horizon for any movement, any sign of danger. As they rested, the young woman finally found the courage to speak again. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. The cowboy shook his head. "No need," he said simply. "Just stay with me, and we'll get through this." Her eyes filled with tears, and she nodded, hugging her mother tightly. There was still fear, but there was also hope. Hope that they could survive the night, that they could reach safety, and that they could find a life beyond fear and danger. The desert night seemed endless, but slowly the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. The sky turned from deep black to pale blue, and the stars faded. The air grew warmer, the wind softening. The cowboy urged the women forward, knowing that the daylight could be both a blessing and a danger. They had to keep moving, but they also had to avoid being seen. The mother's steps were slow and careful, guided by her daughter and the cowboy's steady hand. Every step brought them closer to the settlement he had spotted the previous day, closer to safety, and closer to the end of their desperate journey. By mid-morning, the trio finally reached the edge of a small village. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the sound of life, voices, children playing, animals moving, filled the air. The cowboy felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They were close now. He guided the women carefully, making sure they stayed out of sight until they could find someone trustworthy. The young woman looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "We made it. We really made it," she whispered. Her mother nodded weakly, tears streaming down her face. The cowboy allowed himself a small smile. They had survived the desert, avoided danger, and found hope. But he knew their journey wasn't over. They still needed help, food, and care. They needed people who would listen, who would protect them. And he would make sure they got it. The young woman and her mother followed him through the streets of the village, trusting the cowboy completely. In that moment, despite exhaustion and fear, there was a sense of relief, a sense of safety, and a growing bond between them. The cowboy had answered the cry for help. He had led them through the night, through danger, and into hope. And as the village came into view, he felt the quiet satisfaction of a man who had done what was right. The journey had been hard, but they were alive. They were safe. And that, he thought, was what mattered most. The sun climbed higher into the sky, warming the desert in a way that made every movement feel heavier. The small village they had reached the night before had offered a brief sense of safety. But the cowboy knew they couldn't stop for long. People here were wary of strangers, and he didn't want to draw attention to the women. They needed to move farther, toward a larger settlement where help would be certain, where food, water, and protection would be available. The young woman walked close to her mother, who still moved slowly from exhaustion and fear. "I never thought I would see this much sand again and still be free," she said softly, almost to herself. Her voice carried a mixture of awe and disbelief. The cowboy gave her a small nod but said nothing. He had heard words like that before. People often underestimated the desert, thinking it was a barren place until they faced it fully. But he had lived in it long enough to know that survival required patience, careful planning, and courage. They left the village at first light, the streets nearly empty, and headed toward the rough trails that would take them across the desert plains. The cowboy's horse, still strong and steady, carried most of the supplies, a small sack of food, a water skin, and blankets. The young woman carried what little she could, helping her mother with the rest. Every step was slow but determined. They moved quietly, careful to avoid attracting attention from anyone who might be searching for them.
The journey through the open desert was grueling.
The heat pressed down and the sand shifted under their feet, making walking difficult. The mother groaned as she struggled to keep up, leaning heavily on her daughter for support. The cowboy stayed ahead, constantly scanning the horizon. "We can rest under that rock formation up ahead," he said, pointing toward a jagged outcropping. "It will give you shade and a place to catch your breath." When they reached the shade, they sank to the ground, letting the wind cool their faces. The young woman gently helped her mother sit down. The cowboy knelt nearby, checking the water and rationing what little they had left. "We don't have much, so drink only what you need," he instructed. The mother nodded, sipping slowly from the water skin. The young woman looked at the cowboy, her eyes filled with gratitude. "I don't know how we can ever thank you," she whispered. "You don't need to," he replied simply. "Just stay with me, and we'll get through this." "That's thanks enough." His words were calm, but there was a quiet determination behind them. He had faced many dangers in his life, but seeing people in need, feeling their fear had a way of focusing him. He knew he could not fail them. As the afternoon wore on, the desert stretched endlessly before them, the sun high and unrelenting. The young woman glanced nervously at every shadow, expecting danger at every turn. Her mother leaned on her, her breathing shallow. The cowboy noticed their fatigue but didn't slow his pace. He had to keep them moving, or they might become easy targets. "Keep going," he said gently. "We're almost at a stream. Water and safety are close." The promise of water gave them renewed energy, and they pressed on. Soon, the sound of flowing water reached their ears, faint but unmistakable. A small creek wound through the desert, a ribbon of silver among the sand and rocks. The cowboy led them down a narrow path hidden by boulders and tall grasses. "Stay close," he whispered. "We need to keep this hidden until we can reach the other side." The young woman knelt beside the creek, helping her mother drink. The water was cool and sweet, a stark contrast to the dry heat of the desert. They drank deeply, feeling some of their strength return. The cowboy kept watch, scanning the area for any sign of trouble. In the quiet moments, the young woman spoke softly about her family, about life before the fear and danger. "Mama and I, we lived in the mountains," she said. "It was peaceful. We never thought something like this could happen." The cowboy listened, nodding slowly. He had seen lives disrupted in ways that seemed unfair, yet he knew that courage often rose from such moments. "It's not over yet," he said carefully. "But you're stronger than you think. Keep going, and you'll see that life can still hold good things." Even with the water and rest, the journey was far from easy. The desert held hidden challenges, sudden drops, rough rocks, and patches of sand that shifted underfoot. At one point, the mother stumbled on a loose rock. The young woman caught her just in time. "Thank you," the mother said weakly, her voice shaking with exhaustion. The cowboy helped them both up, giving them steadying hands. "We move carefully," he said, "one step at a time." The hours passed slowly but gradually. The landscape began to change. The desert's harsh monotony gave way to rolling hills and small clusters of trees. Birds called in the distance, and the occasional animal track appeared in the soft soil. It was a sign that life existed beyond the barren desert, a sign that safety might be near. The cowboy allowed himself a small sense of relief, though he remained vigilant. The journey was not over, and danger could still appear at any moment. As evening approached, the cowboy spotted a faint trail leading to a larger settlement. He guided the women toward it, keeping them low and quiet. The young woman's heart raced with anticipation and hope. "Do you think we'll be safe there?" she asked. "We will be," he said. "Just stay close and we'll make it together." The settlement grew larger as they approached, with houses and small shops lining the dusty streets. Smoke rose from chimneys, signaling life, food, and safety. The cowboy led the women carefully, making sure they stayed out of sight until they found someone trustworthy. The young woman looked at him with wide, grateful eyes. "We made it. We really made it," she whispered. Her mother nodded weakly, tears in her eyes. The cowboy allowed himself a small smile. They had survived the desert, avoided danger, and found hope. But reaching the settlement was only the beginning. The cowboy knew they needed help, and he had to find someone reliable. He led them to a small, sturdy building where a woman was tending to chores outside. The cowboy called out softly, explaining that these women needed assistance. The woman looked them over, noticing their exhaustion, dirt, and fear. Without hesitation, she guided them inside, offering water, food, and blankets. The young woman's eyes filled with tears as she knelt beside her mother, helping her to drink and eat slowly. The cowboy stayed outside for a moment, watching the horizon. Dace. He could feel the tension of the past days slowly leaving him. The desert had been harsh, but he had kept them safe. He had answered a cry for help, and now he could see the first signs of recovery in the women he had saved. Inside, the mother began to regain some of her strength. She spoke softly to her daughter, expressing gratitude and relief. The young woman hugged her tightly, whispering words of comfort. Outside, the cowboy allowed himself a moment to breathe, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had guided them through danger, uncertainty, and fear. And though their journey was far from over, the hardest parts had been survived. As night fell over the settlement, the women rested safely inside. The cowboy rode his horse to the edge of town, scanning the surrounding hills. He knew that danger could still exist, but for now, the immediate threat was gone. The young woman and her mother had survived, and they were in good hands. The cowboy felt a quiet pride. He had done what he could, and now it was time for others to help them heal. The young woman finally spoke from inside the building, her voice carrying through the open window.
Rasp.
Thank you for everything, she said softly. The cowboy tipped his hat, a small gesture that said more than words could.
"St, keep strong," he said. "You've already shown more courage than most people do in a lifetime." As he rode off into the night, the stars overhead sparkled like tiny beacons of hope. The desert had tested them. The journey had been long and dangerous, but the women had survived. And the cowboy, quiet and steady as always, knew that he had done the right thing. Courage, compassion, and determination had carried them through. The story of the desert, the canyon, and the cry for help would not be forgotten. For the young woman and her mother, it was the beginning of a new chapter, a chapter of safety, recovery, and hope. And for the cowboy, it was another reminder that even in a harsh, unforgiving world, small acts of bravery could change lives forever. The morning sun rose over the small settlement, casting a warm, golden light across the dusty streets. Birds called in the trees, and the distant sound of a blacksmith's hammer echoed through the village. Inside the small building where the mother and daughter had found shelter, the air was quiet but full of life. The mother's breathing had grown steadier, and her eyes, once wide with fear, now held a fragile relief. Her daughter moved carefully, helping her mother wash and eat, her hands trembling slightly but steadying with purpose.
The cowboy had stayed nearby, riding his horse slowly through the outskirts of the settlement.
He kept watch, making sure that no strangers approached who might bring danger. Though the immediate threat had passed, he knew the world could be cruel, and safety was never guaranteed. The desert had tested them all, and he had learned that vigilance was as important as courage.
Yet, for the first time in days, there was a sense of calm, a quiet hope that things could begin to heal.
Inside, the young woman spoke softly to her mother. "Mama, we can rest now. We are safe here." The mother nodded, her voice still weak but filled with gratitude. I never thought we would make it," she said. Tears ran slowly down her cheeks. The young woman embraced her mother tightly, feeling the weight of fear and exhaustion ease slightly. The cowboy watched from the doorway, his heart quietly swelling with satisfaction. He had done what he could, and now it was up to others to help them recover fully. Later in the morning, a local healer arrived, a kind woman with gentle hands and steady eyes. She offered water, herbs, and warm food, and she checked the mother's injuries carefully. The young woman followed every move, asking questions and listening to every word. Relief and curiosity mingled in her expression, and the cowboy stood by quietly, letting them adjust to the presence of help. He had guided them this far. Now it was time for the community to take over. The mother rested as the healer worked, her breathing now calm and measured. She looked up at her daughter, a faint smile breaking through the exhaustion. And brave. We made it because we did not give up. The young woman nodded, her eyes bright despite the shadows under them. And because we had someone who helped us, she added, glancing toward the cowboy, who met her gaze with a steady nod. There was no need for words. The bond of trust and gratitude between them had been formed in the hardest hours of fear and uncertainty. Outside, the cowboy walked slowly through the settlement, the horse following him obediently. He thought of the desert trails, the nights under the stars, and the countless dangers they had avoided together. Each step reminded him of the cries he had answered, the fear he had seen, and the courage he had witnessed. The young woman had shown bravery far beyond her years, and her mother had endured fear and pain with quiet resilience. Their survival was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. As the day wore on, the young woman and her mother began to regain more strength. They ate carefully, drank water, and listened to the healer's advice. The cowboy stayed nearby, offering guidance when needed, but allowing them space to recover. Slowly, laughter began to return. Small at first, tentative, but growing steadily. The young woman shared stories of life before the desert, of mountains, rivers, and quiet evenings by the fire. The mother listened, sometimes joining in with soft words. It was a simple, peaceful moment, but one that held deep meaning after the fear and exhaustion of the past days. In the afternoon, the cowboy led them to a small garden behind the building. Fresh vegetables grew in neat rows, and the air was fragrant with herbs. This will help you regain strength, he said. And keep your minds busy, too. The young woman smiled, kneeling beside her mother to tend the garden. They planted seeds together, their hands working in the soil, a symbol of new life and hope. The cowboy watched, feeling a quiet warmth in his chest. He had saved them, yes, but he had also given them a chance to begin again. Even as the women recovered, the cowboy remained vigilant. He patrolled the outskirts of the settlement, keeping an eye on the surrounding desert and nearby hills. Shadows moved with the wind, but no threat emerged. He allowed himself a small sense of relief. Immediate danger was gone. The desert had been harsh and unforgiving, but courage, care, and determination had carried them through. As evening fell, the settlement grew quieter. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with pinks and purples. The mother and daughter sat outside, watching the stars begin to shine.
Do you think...
We will be truly safe now? The young woman asked softly. The cowboy stood nearby, his eyes scanning the horizon, but his expression calm. Safer than before, he said. And stronger. You've learned how strong you are. That is something no one can take away. The mother reached out to hold her daughter's hand. We owe our lives to him, she whispered. The young woman nodded, tears sparkling in the starlight. Yes, we will never forget it. The cowboy tipped his hat quietly, a simple gesture of acknowledgement. There was no need for grand speeches. The gratitude and trust between them spoke louder than words ever could. Over the next few days, the mother and daughter continued to regain their strength. They explored the settlement carefully, learning the routines, meeting kind villagers, and slowly feeling a sense of normalcy return. The cowboy remained nearby, sometimes guiding them, sometimes observing from a distance, making sure they were safe. The bond that had formed during the desperate escape grew stronger. They spoke often, sharing thoughts, fears, and hopes for the future. The cowboy saw the change in them, the fear in their eyes replaced by cautious hope, the tension in their movements softened by trust and care. One afternoon, as the sun hung low over the hills, the cowboy prepared to leave the settlement. He had done what he could, and it was time for him to continue his journey. He rode slowly to the mother and daughter, who had come outside to see him off. Thank you, the young woman said, her voice steady and sincere. For everything. You saved our lives. You saved yourselves too, he said. I just helped you along the way. Remember what you learned. Courage, patience, and hope. That will carry you farther than any horse or trail ever could. The mother reached out to touch his arm, a simple gesture of gratitude. "We will never forget you," she said softly. "You will always be part of our story." The cowboy nodded, tipping his hat once more. "Take care of each other," he said, "and never lose hope." As he rode away from the settlement, the young woman and her mother watched until he disappeared over the distant hills. Their hearts were full of gratitude, their minds filled with the lessons of courage and survival. They had faced fear and danger together, and now they were safe, stronger, and ready to rebuild their lives. The desert behind them was quiet, vast, and unforgiving, but it had also been a place where courage shone brightly. The cowboy had answered a desperate cry, guiding them through the night and danger, and giving them a chance at life and hope. The young woman and her mother would carry that memory forever, a story of bravery, compassion, and the difference one person could make when they chose to help. Night fell over the settlement, and the stars sparkled above like tiny beacons of hope. Inside, the mother and daughter rested peacefully for the first time in days. Outside, the cowboy rode steadily through the hills, the wind on his face and the horizon ahead. The desert had tested him, just as it had tested them, but courage and compassion had triumphed, and in the quiet, under the vast sky, the story of survival, hope, and the human spirit continued, a story that would never be forgotten. The next morning, the settlement woke to the sun shining brightly. Life resumed its quiet rhythm, and the mother and daughter began their days with renewed energy and purpose. They worked together in the garden, helped the villagers, and slowly found joy in simple things: laughter, shared meals, and the comfort of being alive. Every step forward reminded them of the courage that had carried them through, and the cowboy's presence in their lives remained a symbol of bravery, kindness, and hope. Time passed, and the young woman and her mother healed fully. They were stronger, wiser, and more aware of the fragility and beauty of life. The cowboy continued his journey through the desert, riding alone but carrying the knowledge that he had made a difference, that his actions had saved lives and restored hope. Dustry, in the hearts of the mother and daughter, and in the quiet memory of the desert, the story lived on. A story of courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between those who choose to help. It was a reminder that even in a harsh world, kindness and bravery could shine brightly, leaving a mark that would endure far beyond the desert sands.